30 years ago, smallpox had been eradicated from the world. WHO had more confidence in their ability to do things, so they had started a program to immunize children of the world. But 8 years after it started, they weren't satisfied with the results. Only 14% of children in the developing world had actually received measles vaccine. And so a number of people, including Jonas Salk, Robert McNamara, went to President Lyman, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and asked if he would have a meeting at Bellagio, get the UN agency heads together, plus others, to ask how could we speed up immunization. Well, that conference ended up forming a task force for child survival, not to coordinate the UN agencies, but to facilitate them, to make sure that they understood what the problems were to improve immunization and figure out ways to solve them. It worked better than anyone could have expected, because 6 years later, the immunization coverage rate for children in the developing world had gone from less than 20% to 80%. So on September 30th, 1990, there was a summit for children at the UN, and Jim Grant, the head of UNICEF, got up and announced 80% of children have now received at least one vaccine. And he said this is the greatest peacetime endeavor that the world has ever seen. So 30 years later, to look back and figure out why did this work so well is very interesting. Not only did it achieve its goal, but it spun off 3 programs, each one providing more than $1 billion worth of services to global health each year. What has happened to me here this time is the chance not only to reflect the same place we met 30 years ago, but to try to figure out what are the lessons of this. And the lessons are becoming clear. We do better together than we do separately. And we know that, and yet we don't always practice that. So we're learning something about what causes a coalition to actually work. And it requires the buy-in of the top agency people. It's not something you could do at mid-level. The top agency people have to say we want to work together. But we've also found that it's important to define from the beginning what is success. What's the last mile? When will you know that you've achieved it? And then people sign on for a definite end rather than signing on because they're interested in a project. We've also found one has to find methods of ego suppression. And particularly when you get to the UN agencies, by the time you're at the head of a UN agency, you have a pretty big ego. And it's very hard to suppress that for a greater good. But the task force allowed that to happen. And so it's an important lesson in coalitions. We also found that it requires a combination of executive leadership, making decisions, and congressional leadership, that is getting people to agree to something ahead of time. So it's not just that all of these things worked. I think we're understanding why they worked.